Hi, and welcome everyone. I'm David Henry Huang. Thanks so much for joining us for this SIGSpace Summit. So this is part of an online series of talks that's hosted by Signature Theater, and it features theater artists and experts in other fields. And so I'm thrilled to be joined today by Dr. Diane C. Fugino. She's a professor of Asian American Studies at UC Santa Barbara and the former director of the Center for Black Studies Research there. Her research examines Japanese American and Asian American activist history within an Asian American radical tradition as shaped by Black power and third world decolonization. She has a new book coming out, Black Power Afterlives, the Enduring Significance of the Black Panther Party. That'll be coming out in September, like really soon. And she's also the author of Heartbeat of Struggle, The Revolutionary Life of Yuri Kochiyama, whom we're going to talk about today. So welcome, Diane. And you're muted. So, we're pretty conscious, Diane and I are pretty conscious of the fact that, we're sort of talking about Black Asian alliances and there's just two Asians here. So I think maybe at some point we will maybe want to have a follow-up conversation with someone who's Black identified. But I want to have this conversation today because over the past few months, Asian Americans have started to confront anti-Blackness in our own communities. And it struck me that the model minority trope and our kind of white adjacent status has become really weirdly primary in our nation's perception of Asian Americans and sometimes the way we perceive ourselves. And it caused me to reflect on the fact that it hasn't always been this way. I mean, I'm old, so I discovered myself as an Asian American. At the same time, I discovered myself as a playwright way back around in the late 70s. And so I began participating in the Asian American movement, which was then fairly new, and learning about our history. And at that time, yes, there was a model minority stereotype that was around, but I don't perceive that it was as central as it is today. And in fact, the entire conception of Asian America was inspired and modeled on Black power. It was a radical revolutionary project in unity with our Black, Latino, and Native siblings in what was then called Third World Solidarity. So your work has focused largely on this period and the earlier period after World War II, and what we might now think of as a different history of Asian American radicalism and progressivism, which I think is as much, if not more, our heritage than this sort of use of model minorityism by the white right to turn us into a wedge against our fellow people of color. So, we'll talk about terms like POC and stuff like that, but let's start with like a big, hard question, which is, so how was Asian America co-opted from being a radical progressive project into something which today is much more synonymous with neoliberalism and model minorityism?
Yep, a great question. Right, a great question. And I think that what is so important to understand, David, you were talking about how it wasn't always this way. And we have to understand that history isn't linear, but it also isn't fixed, right? So things change. And in the 1800s, right, Chinese and Japanese, the two largest groups, were seen really as yellow peril threats, right? We were mainly laborers. We were seen as hard physical people, and there were concerns. Japan in particular, once they did the 1882 Chinese Exclusion Act, and Japan became rising as a global capitalist power and a global imperial power, right? Around the turn of last century, they really became threats to the United States as both, these are my studies as a ethnic studies scholar and a historian studying some of this, is Walter Lafabre talks about World War II as a clash of empire between the US and Japan fighting for the Pacific. And so as all of that was happening in decades before World War II, Japanese really were seen as those yellow peril threats. We can put up any of those horrible images, right? And in many ways, Japanese were seen as more threatening than Blacks in the early part of the 20th century. And then much of that changes after World War II. That's the moment when Japanese are very quickly turned from enemy into model citizens, when and we see a lot of shifts happen at that moment. And part of this, as Christina Klein and others talk about, it is very much about this U.S. in the aftermath of World War II becomes the world dominant power and wants to see itself as different from old world colonialism, right? Sees itself in the vein of American exceptionalism, as being the promoter of equality and freedom and democracy. And yet they are engaging in imperial projects, especially in Asia and the Pacific. So in order to deal with that, it becomes in their interest to reduce and diminish anti-Asian racism. And so that's the moment when you see this, an opening up of the suburbs to Asians, but not to Blacks and others, right? An opening of jobs, which didn't happen before World War II, on par with people's college educations and some equivalents to whites. All of this began to change structurally in the aftermath of World War II. And that's when we see the model minority trope really begin to rise. But it's important to understand that it isn't just something that's about an image that's false, that undercuts and erases anti-Asian racism that exists. It's also very much about enabling the US to expand in ways and to have more global power.
So you write a lot about the Japanese progressives, the Nisei progressive movement, right after World War II. And what was really striking to me as I got to read some of your stuff is that, you know, you have this group of Japanese Americans after World War II. They've just been incarcerated in American concentration camps, the vast majority of them, through the length of the war. So, and there's, you know, enormous still anti-Japanese American, anti-Asian racism in this country. And yet the Nisei progressives form this movement, and they are against certain pieces of legislation and certain policies which would benefit them personally as a group, but would be oppressive to other marginalized peoples. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah. The Nisei progressives are a group that almost nobody knows about. The more progressive or radical Japanese American activism that existed immediately after World War II is barely known, right? We only know of kind of an assimilationist politic. And the Nisei progressives formed first in 1948, vying for Henry Wallace, right, a Progressive Party candidate. And then when he didn't win, they turned into the Nisei progressives, these somewhat more permanent structures than, right? And one of the things that they did was really amazing is that the 1952 Immigration Act, right, which granted citizenship to Japanese Americans, the most important component of that was naturalization for Japanese American immigrants. And they actually advocated against this. Of course, they wanted immigration rights. Of course, they wanted naturalization for their Issei parents, right? It not only gave them citizenship rights, but it also overturned hundreds of discriminatory laws based on that status, right? Aliens ineligible to citizenship. But they saw that Immigration Act, the McCarran-Walter Act, as both anti-Asian. Only Asians were enumerated by national origin. So if you were Chinese anywhere in the world, you would be counted in China's tiny 105 quota numbers to enter the US. They saw it as anti-Black and they saw it as anti-left. And so they said, we are not going to accept gains for Japanese Americans, though we want that, at the expense of other groups.
Great. And just to clarify, like, so this is 150, like 105, a quota of 105 Asians who get admitted into the Chinese who get into the country will be admitted into America each year.
Correct.
Okay. Sorry.
And that was part of the problem, right? Because Britain had 65,000 and Germany had 25,000. So they saw such racial inequality in the McCarran-Walter Act of 1952, right? And then the Nice progressives enacted really what I think we're talking about here: deep solidarity, right? A willingness to not accept their own gains at the expense of others, right? And to stand in deep solidarity with others. Mm-hmm.
So then we go a little bit into going forward in history. And I'm going to talk, of course, about Yuri Kochiyama, who you've written a book about, who's a central figure in Asian American radicalism, who, you know, people who know her probably or only vaguely maybe associate her with that image of the Nisei woman who's holding Malcolm X's head after he's been shot. But in another amazing example of revolution morphing into neoliberalism, Yuri was also celebrated in 2016 with a Google Doodle. So, so for those of you who are watching us who aren't familiar with Yuri, can you tell us a little bit about her?
Yes. And I think that that's important what you're saying, right? There are ways in which radicals can be turned into safer places, right? Malcolm X also had a postage stamp, right? And I think it's important to also understand that at that moment, right, there were shotguns and guns going off in the Audubon ballroom at the moment that Malcolm is assassinated. And Yuri, I've had Black activists and others talk to me about this moment and say, it was amazing. Everyone was ducking for cover. Yuri had her 16-year-old son, Billy, with her, and she ran up on stage, you know, this incredible person who was fearless, who thought about others, who engaged again in those deep solidarities, right? So Yuri Kochiyama, just, I mean, she's so fascinating and such important, not just because she's associated with Black Power and Malcolm X, but because of the ways that she lived her life as a political activist and just as a human being. She was born in 1921 in San Pedro. She went through the concentration camps. Her father had just come home from ulcer surgery on Pearl Harbor Day, right, December 7th, 1941. They whisked him away in this, in the first set of detentions on Pearl Harbor Day. And they released him 6 weeks later only because he was on his deathbed. And so the kinds of traumas that people had, right? And then that was January. And then in April, she and her family and most Japanese Americans are moved into the so-called assembly centers. In her case, what used to be the Santa Anita horse tracks, right? And then moved to Jerome, Arkansas concentration camp. But it's so interesting because out of all of this, she wrote in her camp diary, you know, that she felt like she wasn't discriminated against at this moment. And it took a growth later in time. In the 50s, she's in New York. She's married to Bill Kochiyama, a Nisei veteran. And they are following the events of the civil rights movement in the newspaper and on TV. They are amazingly, because Yuri, her whole life, has opened her home to host people. They're inviting speakers who are coming to New York to come to their small apartment in Midtown. And then in 1960, she moves to New York for no political reasons. Her husband, they have an opportunity to move closer to her husband, and they move into a housing project in New York. And she immediately gets involved in the community around her, fighting for better education for the children of Harlem, right? Mostly Black children, but also her own children. And not afraid to associate with radicals at that moment. When she first meets Malcolm, she admires him, she's drawn to him, but she disagrees with what she called his harsh stance on integration. But after he invites her to his organization of Afro-American Unity Liberation School, and she learns things about a history of structural racism and anti-Black racism, which was different than what she had been taught, right? There's a mistake, you correct it, right? Everything's fine. And it completely transformed her life. So after Malcolm was assassinated in 1965, she worked with some of the most radical Black organizations like the Republic of New Africa. She started to work on political prisoners, which I can speak a little bit more about if that's helpful. in the Puerto Rican movement, and people just associate her with the Black movement. She was really active in the Asian American movement as well.
Yeah, I was fortunate enough to get to meet Yuri in New York when I first started producing plays at the Public Theater downtown in the early 80s. You know, she was just somebody who like had parties, had dinner parties at her, she and Bill at their place in Harlem. And, you know, I knew that, oh yeah, she was like involved, like she's a radical or something like that. But she just at that point felt also to me like just someone who's a really warm and enthusiastic older Japanese American woman, and just really excited about the arts and the fact that, you know, Asian American stuff was getting produced, and a supporter of people. And, you know, you use you sort of qualify or put her in the type of work she does for the Black movement as their spokesperson and then their center person. Can you explain that term? Because I found it really interesting.
Yeah, I borrow from Karen Sachs when I use this term center person leadership. And, you know, so often people think of leadership as that spokesperson, the people who hold all the titles, often embodied by men, right? But there's another kind of leadership that we're seeing more in the movements today that's embraced, which is the center person leadership. Those who support and network with people, who know people, who take time to build the relationships, who care about the individuals as human beings in the movement, right? Not just for their kind of abilities to get to get something done. And so the person that you're describing is the same person who I felt I knew, right? Just caring, loving, wanting to feed people, wanting to hear about people. And she loved the arts, and some of her kids were in the theater and arts and dance. And I'm sure she just loved talking to you about Asian American theater. And, you know, seeing someone like you really building Asian American theater would have thrilled her.
Yeah, particularly her son Eddie then came to, I don't know if he came to San Francisco for a while, but he married a woman named Pamela Wu, who was a producer at the Asian American Theater Company in San Francisco in the 80s. So they were, you know, as you say, they were definitely involved in theater. And yeah, let's talk a little bit about her work with political prisoners, because that continued really, I think, till the end of her life, yes?
Yes. I would say that it was, I called the biography on her Heartbeat of Struggle, because that's what she called the political prisoners, but that's what they called her. And so she gets involved in the early to mid 1960s, so pretty early on in this, when the people that she's working with start to get arrested. Sofia Bakari is one of them. And so she gets involved, she starts writing to them. She's always been a big writer, right? This was before the time of internet, and correspondence was really big. She was a journalism major at Compton City College. But it was also important to her that she had been incarcerated, right? That her father was incarcerated and died during his detention. And that she understood how important it was to hear from people on the outside and how much getting mail meant to her. And so she used those experiences to support political prisoners. So of course she worked to try to get, these are incarcerated activists, right? Targeted because their politics or their affiliations or their ideas, often it's their ideas, were threats to the established order. And it was always really important to her to support them and to try to get them out, but also to support them as human beings. She encouraged people to send them packages at Christmas or even the holidays, which people don't think of these radical activists doing, right? But Valentine's Day, she wanted a card. Even Easter, at least up to a certain point, was, you know, she always encouraged people to send care packages at Christmas to remember people on their birthdays.
Great.
Yeah.
So I want to ask you about the term, about the phrase, I can't breathe. Obviously, we very much associate with George Floyd, but you also have a sense of it being a metaphor for the world we live in right now. And I found that really interesting.
Yeah. I've been thinking about this as I can't breathe as a mantra for our times, right? Um, of course, it signals George Floyd, Eric Gardner, right? Gratuitous police and state violence against Black people and Black communities, right? I'm in California, right, where global warming and ecological disasters have now resulted in an unprecedented 650 wildfires burning in this state, and the smoke-filled air, right? We can't breathe. Of course, it invokes, I think, coronavirus, right, which also is another way in which we can't breathe. Um, and it signals really two things. One is it lays bare the kinds of structural inequalities that have existed for a long time, right? Incarceration, poverty, lack of housing, lack of education, lack of access to healthcare, all these things which we know affect Black and Brown and Indigenous and poor communities disproportionately. But it also signals the failures, right, of a government to put human life above profit, right? Or to build public infrastructures like a public health system. But I've also been thinking, so those are always the things that we think about, the traumas, the horrors. I feel like they're with us every single day, right? And now Jacob Blake and more, right? But breath also signals a healing, right? A literal and figurative salvation, a transcendence, right? Breath literally creates us and is necessary for our existence, right? We can use breath in meditation and yoga and Tai Chi, right? It calms us, it releases our energies, it connects us to other people and to Mother Earth. And it really also, I think, enables wisdom. And I think it enables a connection to our ancestors. And breath is transcendent. So this is some of the ways that I've been thinking about.
That's amazing. That's great. I'm going to throw a few terms at you and just get your quick reaction to them. So third world unity. This is something that I grew up with. I mean, you know, when I in college and became interested in Asian American things, which feels, you know, I like it nostalgically. It feels outdated to me now because what is the third world? What's the first world? You know, it's sort of centered. I think you still maybe don't hate it.
I don't. I love it. I think I was just so shaped by that, right? You're right, though. I mean, it's a different world, right? The political economy is completely different. You keep talking about neoliberalism, right? We used to be in a welfare state 50 years ago, which enabled different kinds of access to funds and resources, right? The Soviet Union fell. So there is some absolute differences. But I think what I love so much about that term, third world solidarity, third world radicalism, is that it really connects unity among people of color in this country with internationalism and with decolonization or anti-colonization, so that we are struggling against patriarchal racial capitalism, in the words of Cedric Robinson, and also against kind of imperial impulses. And I think that that's what I really love, rather than just staying domestically. And I think in some ways, that's some difference between, there are actually many differences between, you know, people say nothing's changed and it feels that way so often, right? But from 50 years ago in the 60s, I think that there is today, there's quite a bit of attention to internationalism and to needing to think about equality for all people, right? Liberation for all people. But I feel like that was so present in the 60s. And sometimes in this movement, in this country, people get stuck in a US-based movement.
Great. Actually, instead of throwing another term at you, I'm going to use that transition and that discussion to transition to a question, because I'd gotten some questions prior to this, beginning this seminar, from people who are going to be on the call. So, and it seems to be a good segue to Juanita Lott. Will you provide the pivotal context of the historic Black Student Union Third World Liberation Front strike movement at San Francisco State University, which led to the first College of Ethnic Studies and inspired the basically all the other Asian American studies departments that are around the country right now. This was 1968. It is, some people say this is where the term Asian American was first used. And yeah, can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah. First, shout outs to all those who are struggled in that moment, that we owe you so much. I just came out of a meeting just this morning with the Santa Barbara Unified School District, and we're trying to get a Black Studies course. We got November of 2018 ethnic studies as a high school graduation requirement, but now in what's happening in the world today, we're trying to get Black Studies. So, and my job teaching Asian American studies, just huge shout out, so much gratitude to you. And that was an incredible moment in which at San Francisco State, the Black Student Union was connected with the Black Panthers, and they really jump-started this. They invited in some of the Asian American organizations. 3 out of the 6 organizations that comprised the Third World Liberation Front at San Francisco State were Asian American groups. Karen Umimoto famously writes about this. And they really wanted transformative things, not just a little bit, not just a seat at the table. They wanted that, but they wanted to restructure education so that it would serve and benefit the majority in communities, working class communities, rather than just being a vehicle for upward mobility. And they felt like they could only do it through unity. And so they worked on that. And today we would say, then they did, most definitely, but today we would really say that there's differential racialization, right? That these groups don't experience racism in the same ways. Asian and Blacks experience racism differently. But, you know, I've been reading, anyways, I can get into that Asian Americans ought not adopt a white model of allyship, but be in solidarity, because we too are impacted by anti-Asian racism and by racism and white supremacy. And I just want to say that I think ethnic studies has been so important to transforming myself, so many of us, because it's sustained learning over time. We have to read, think, listen, learn, engage in discussion, and then it changes how we then co-create, right? What we write about, what we create, the movements we work in. And then that changes more. So it's really about transforming knowledge and transforming each one of us, and hopefully transforming society.
Yeah, it's amazing to sort of look back on I once asked the Japanese American playwright Philip Congo Tanda, who's a good friend of mine. We came up together, we used to play in a band together. Maybe about 15 years ago, I said, what has happened with Asian American writing that you didn't expect when we first started out? And he said, oh, I never expected we would be studied in schools. So even something which feels relatively innocuous now, the idea that, oh, our works would just be read in universities, even that felt like quite a major and impossible goal when we started out. So
can I just say, I think that's really important, actually, right? It sounds really simple, but countering Asian American invisibility, I think really matters, right? We hardly see ourselves, but I also want to caution, because sometimes we want visibility, but we have to say for what purpose, right? And is it just to uplift ourselves, or is it really has a different kind of transcendent, transformative goal of being in solidarity with others, of gaining liberation for all peoples?
So you're mentioning a moment earlier, anti-Asian racism, and certainly the COVID crisis has highlighted for me the degree to which model minorityism has been a complete failure. That this notion that we would be able to transcend racism somehow, or be immune from it by accommodating racism, turns out to be completely wrong. That at any moment, which we consistently see in American history, at any moment, the status of Asian Americans turns on a dime, whether it's World War II and the incarceration of Japanese Americans, or the murder of Vincent Chin, and now the wave of anti-Asian racism as a result of COVID-19. We had a question about how to address that. I can't quite find it right now, but how do we deal with anti-Asian racism now? I would say the same way we always should by opposing it, but do you have any other thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, that's a big question, right? But I do want to say that you're absolutely right? This model minority, that pathway is a failure, right? It doesn't work. It never really worked. And that we can so easily be turned from the model minority into the yellow peril, depending on what's happening. So, this moment, Minju Bae and Mark Zhang Putterman write this great piece on reviving the history of radical Black Asian internationalism. And in it, they link what they call these, right, the social upheavals of the pandemic, racialized as Oriental, and Black uprisings against white supremacy, policing, right? And so this requires, as they're talking about, us to be in solidarity with each other. And I just want to name a couple of pieces that I found really useful on thinking about solidarity and not a model of white allyship. One's by Hae-Jing Shim, Questions on the Limit and Effects of Asian American Allyship. And the other is by Sung-Young Chaimoro. It's an op-ed in Color Lines talking about solidarity, not allyship, a call to the Asian American and Pacific Islander communities. And in it, they are both talking about how important it is not just to try to build on our closeness to whiteness, right? And to recognize that white supremacy impacts us as well, and that we need to be talking about this and showing the ways in which anti-Asian racism exists, as well as the kinds of struggles that we have. So, how do we create change? Is that part of the question? A big question, right? I can try to address that if that's helpful, but it's a huge question.
Yeah, if you've got an idea on that, we're really open.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I wish I had my 1, 2, 3 and everything were, poof, and it was all gone. But
go ahead.
Oh, I was going to say, I think that some of it is very much about educating ourselves and reading, right? And there's a bunch of great things out there. There's like Black feminists and Asian American feminists. There's all sorts of readings that are out there. I think another thing is we have to work structurally, right? So whether that means changing the Electoral College, right? Changing funding priorities so that we think about defunding the police rather than just diversity trainings, right? I think because we're in the greatest economic disaster since the Great Depression, and it's all indicators it's going to get worse. We need those funds to be put in education and healthcare and jobs and housing, right? We're at a mega housing crisis. And so I think we really need to figure out how to, if I may say, change the taxing scheme, right? The way that and figure out really structural ways to reprioritize the kinds of programs that matter and defunding. And so part of this is going to be very much about listening to the people who are working on and struggling on the streets, because we activists all have a lot of great ideas, and if there are ways to listen to it. I also think that the more that we can do things through self-sufficiency, the better. I don't think that we can completely detangle ourselves from the state, but the more we can do things through self-sufficiency. So here in Santa Barbara, we're starting what's called Cooperation Santa Barbara, and we pattern ourselves after Cooperation Jackson in Jackson, Mississippi, that's trying to build an alternative and democratic political economy through cooperatives. They're huge, huge ventures. In New York and Wisconsin and elsewhere, the city councils have given a few $1 million to support cooperative businesses. So we don't have to rely on funders and a charity model, but we can actually produce the kinds of organic, locally grown foods that people need, and then use that to pay workers well, I mean, humongous problems, but people have ideas. Those who are obstacles need to get out of the way and change the structures.
Great. I mean, I feel like if we go back to this term third world solidarity, whether or not it is literally accurate anymore, but the reality is that the emerging American majority is our people of color, our BIPOCs, and for us to ally against white patriarchy feels like there's an opportunity to actually win this and to change the structure of society. And so Kathy Masaoka asks, what have been the barriers to building a long-lasting alliance between the Asian American community and the Black community?
Hi, Kathy. She's one of the old school veterans. And I also have to say that some of Yuri Kochiyama's families tuning in, I believe, they told me.
Okay.
And so some of these folks would be able to answer this, you know, even better, right? Been involved in the NCRR dress and now doing so much work. After 9/11, Kathy Masaoka and the NCRR were involved in fighting anti-Muslim racism and so forth. I think that Yuri, again, a huge question, right? What are barriers? How do we forge alliances, Black Asian alliances? But I think Yuri presents a model, right? She went in, she listened, she didn't work through ego, she was willing to do the work that was needed. But yet she didn't just put herself in a secondary place. She also initiated things, was someone people really looked to and saw as core to the movement, in part because she was constantly present. She showed up. I think showing up is one of the most important things that we can do. And I think that the more that we do this, and the more that we see our own liberation as Asian Americans, intricately linked to the liberation of Black people and others, the more that we learn how to do the right things, right? We don't vote or make decisions based on our own self-interest, but we do it for the least among us, right? And so I really like that statement that all lives will matter when Black lives matter. And I think that that kind of thinking is part of what it is going to take.
Great. And on that note, I think we've run out of time, but it's great to end really by talking about Yuri, because so much of she's an emblem and an activist who put into practice so many of the things that I think we all can learn from and all can expand our own activity and advocacy. So thank you all for joining us for this SIG Summit. There's a lot more to talk about, and maybe we'll find some other opportunities to do that. And special thanks to Diane for joining us today. Everybody stay safe.